The champagne flute felt cool in my hand as I stood in the corner of the dimly lit lounge. The sound of laughter and chatter filled the air around me. But my mind was elsewhere. It was my birthday, and my coworkers had insisted on throwing me a party. I had protested, of course, claiming I didn't need the fuss, but they didn't listen. So here I was, surrounded by balloons and well wishes, trying to enjoy myself but feeling oddly detached. And then I saw him. Julian. He stood across the room, holding court like only he could. Even at 62, he had a presence that commanded attention. The way he moved, the way he spoke, he was magnetic. I had always admired him from a distance. Julian, the seasoned stage actor turned voice talent, had been working with my team for a few months now, lending his voice and gravitas to one of our most ambitious gaming projects. He was charming, professional, and just aloof enough to be fascinating. But tonight, there was something different about the way he looked at me. I was mid-conversation with a colleague when Julian appeared at my side. "Margot," he said smoothly, his deep voice cutting through the noise, "may I steal you for a moment?" My coworker stepped aside, and before I could process what was happening, Julian was leading me toward a quieter corner of the room. He handed me a fresh glass of champagne, his fingers brushing mine as he did. "Happy birthday," he said, his lips curving into a small smile. "Thank you," I replied, my voice coming out softer than I intended. He raised his glass, his gaze locking with mine. "To you," he said, "and to all the things you deserve but don't allow yourself to have." His words took me by surprise, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. The way he looked at me, intense, knowing, sent a shiver down my spine. Before I could say anything, he reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear. The gesture was subtle, almost innocent, but it lingered. "Enjoy your night, Margot," he said, his voice low and warm. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. But the feeling he left behind stayed with me, buzzing like static electricity in the air. After the party, I couldn't stop thinking about Julian. It wasn't just the way he spoke to me or the lingering touch that sent a shiver down my spine. It was the way he made me feel. Seen. Not as a senior director, not as someone's mother, and not as a woman edging into her late 50s. He looked at me like I was something else. That night, as I slipped off my heels and peeled away the dress that had started to feel too tight after hours of smiling and making small talk, I caught myself in the mirror. It was the same face I saw every day, laugh lines, faint crow's feet, and a touch of gray at my temples. I tried to remember the last time someone looked at me the way Julian had. I couldn't. I first met Julian 6 months ago. He came onto the project as a voice actor for one of our most ambitious gaming narratives, a dark, brooding anti-hero with layers of pain and charisma that only Julian could embody. His stage presence was legendary, though he had stepped back from live theater years ago. He was polite but distant at first, a consummate professional. He addressed everyone with the same warmth and respect, yet never let anyone get too close. I admired him for it. His ability to stay both approachable and untouchable. Working with him was seamless. He'd stride into the recording booth, headphones in place, and deliver his lines with the kind of gravitas that silenced the entire room. It was hard not to be drawn to him, and I wasn't the only one who noticed. Half the team seemed to have some level of fascination with Julian. But for me, it was different. I told myself it was purely professional, an admiration for his craft. And yet there were moments when I'd catch myself watching him a little too long, or feeling the brush of his hand during a handshake a little too keenly. It was harmless, I told myself. Until my birthday. The Monday after the party, Julian stopped by my office. I was reviewing scripts, my desk cluttered with notes and marked up pages, when I heard the familiar knock on the doorframe. "Am I interrupting?" he asked, his voice smooth and warm. I looked up, startled but pleased to see him. "Not at all, come in." He stepped inside, his presence immediately filling the room. He wore a fitted blazer over a black shirt, and for a moment I forgot what I was supposed to say. "I just wanted to say thank you," he began, leaning casually against the edge of my desk. "For the party. It was a lovely evening." I blinked. "Thank me? I didn't plan it." "No," he said, his lips quirking into a small smile. "But you were the reason for it, and I don't think I've had that much fun at a work event in years." I laughed softly, trying to ignore the flutter in my chest. I'll pass that along to the team. He tilted his head, his gaze steady. You're modest, Margot. You don't give yourself enough credit. The compliment caught me off guard, and I felt a faint blush rise to my cheeks. Well, thank you, Julian. That's kind of you to say. He nodded, standing upright again. I won't keep you, just wanted to stop by. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. Oh, and Margot? Yes? Let me know if you'd like to grab dinner sometime. I'd love to hear your thoughts on some ideas for the script. My breath caught, but I forced myself to stay composed. Of course, I said, keeping my tone light. Just let me know when. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a flicker of something dangerous through me. I will. And then he was gone, leaving me alone in my office, my heart racing. I spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Julian. There was something about the way he spoke to me, the way he held gaze just a little too long, that unsettled me in the best way. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. He was just being polite, charming, the way he always was. But deep down, I knew better. That evening, as I packed up my things and prepared to leave, I saw Julian again. He was in the parking lot, leaning against his car, scrolling through his phone. When he looked up and saw me, his face lit up. Margot, he called, slipping his phone into his pocket. I hesitated but walked over to him. Still here? Wanted to catch you before you left, he said, his tone casual but his eyes intent. About dinner, are you free tomorrow night? I hesitated, my mind racing. I knew this wasn't just about work, but the thought of spending an evening with him, just the two of us, was too tempting to resist. Yes, I said finally. I'm free. Perfect, he said, smiling. I'll text you the details. As I walked to my car, I felt a mix of excitement and unease. I wasn't sure what I was getting myself into, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't care. Something was happening between Julian and me, and I wasn't ready to stop it. The next evening, I stood in front of my mirror, second-guessing my outfit for the 5th time. I'd chosen a simple black dress, nothing too revealing, but flattering enough to feel confident. My hair was styled loosely, and I'd taken the time to apply a subtle touch of makeup. It's just dinner, I told myself, but the way my heart was pounding said otherwise. Julian had texted earlier with the name of the restaurant, Vermilion. 7 p.m. Can't wait to see you. The words lingered in my mind as I grabbed my coat and left the house. When I arrived, he was already waiting. The restaurant was intimate, the kind of place with low lighting and candlelit tables. Julian stood near the entrance, dressed in a navy blazer that made his silver hair seem even more striking. When he saw me, his face broke into a smile that made me feel warm all over. Margot, he said, stepping forward to greet me. You look stunning. Thank you, I replied, feeling a blush rise to my cheeks. You don't look too bad yourself. He chuckled, his hand lightly touching my back as he guided me inside. The dinner began innocently enough. We talked about work, the progress on the game, and his experiences as a stage actor. He shared stories about his time in London, performing in packed theaters, and the way transitioning to voice acting had given him a new perspective on storytelling. You must miss the stage, I said, taking a sip of my wine. Sometimes, he admitted, but there's something freeing about lending just your voice to a character. It lets the audience fill in the rest. His eyes met mine, and I felt the weight of his gaze. Besides, there are other ways to keep the passion alive. The conversation shifted then, subtly but unmistakably. By the time dessert arrived, the tension between us was palpable. Julian leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a softer, more intimate tone. You're remarkable, you know, he said, his eyes locked on mine. I let out a nervous laugh, unsure how to respond. You're being too kind. No, he said firmly. I mean it. The way you carry yourself, the way you command a room without even trying, it's rare. His words made my heart race. No one had spoken to me like that in years, and it felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Julian, I began, but he reached across the table, his fingers brushing against mine. You don't have to say anything, he said quietly. I just wanted you to know. After dinner, he insisted on walking me to my car. The night air was cool, and the quiet hum of the city surrounded us as we made our way to the parking lot. Thank you for tonight, I said when we reached my car. It was lovely. The pleasure was mine, he replied, his voice low. For a moment we stood there, the silence stretching between us. Then before I could process what was happening, he stepped closer, his hand gently cupping my face. "Margot," he murmured, his breath warm against my skin, and then he kissed me. It was slow at first, tentative, as if he was waiting for me to pull away. But when I didn't, the kiss deepened, his hands sliding to my waist as he pulled me closer. My own hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping the fabric of his blazer, as the world around us seemed to fade away. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathless. "I've wanted to do that since the party," he admitted, his forehead resting against mine. "Julian?" I whispered, my mind racing. "This isn't." "Don't," he said gently, his thumb brushing against my cheek. "Don't tell me it's wrong, not tonight." I closed my eyes, torn between the logical part of me that knew this was a mistake and the part that craved the way he made me feel. Finally I nodded. "Not tonight." The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and unspoken tension. At work, we kept things professional, but there were glances, fleeting touches, and conversations that lingered just a little too long. Every time I saw him, my heart raced, and I found myself looking forward to the next time we'd be alone. That opportunity came sooner than I expected. One evening, after a particularly long day of recording sessions, Julian knocked on my office door. "Come in," I called, expecting Ella, my assistant. When Julian stepped inside, my breath caught. He closed the door behind him, his expression serious but his eyes soft. "Are you free tonight?" he asked, his voice low. I hesitated, my mind immediately racing through all the reasons I should say no. But then I saw the way he was looking at me, like I was the only person in the world. "Yes," I said quietly. We ended up at his apartment that night. It was a modest space filled with books, framed posters from old plays, and a faint scent of cedarwood. "This is where you live?" I asked, looking around. He smiled, shrugging. "It's not much, but it's home." Before I could say anything else, he stepped closer, his hands resting lightly on my hips. "I'm glad you came." "Me too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The kiss that followed was slow and deliberate, his hands sliding up my back as he guided me toward the couch. Everything about him, his touch, his scent, the way he whispered my name, felt intoxicating. That night was unlike anything I'd experienced in years. Julian wasn't just attentive. He was present in a way that made me feel cherished, desired, and utterly alive. As we lay tangled together afterward, the city lights filtering through the curtains, he turned to me and said, "You deserve to feel like this every day." His words stayed with me long after I left his apartment, a quiet echo in the back of my mind. From that night on, everything changed. We began finding excuses to see each other. Dinners that turned into long, passionate evenings, late-night calls that ended with whispered confessions. The secrecy of it all only made it more thrilling, but it also made it dangerous. I told myself I could handle it, that I could keep this part of my life separate from everything else. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before the lines blurred. After that night at Julian's apartment, there was no turning back. Our connection burned too brightly, and the pull between us was impossible to ignore. We became consumed by the thrill of stolen moments and the secrecy that surrounded our affair. It wasn't just the physical aspect, though that was intoxicating. It was the way he made me feel seen and alive in a way I hadn't been for years. The first time we crossed the line at work was after another late-night recording session. Everyone else had left for the day, and I was finishing up notes in my office when Julian knocked on the door. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his presence filling the room in that way only he could. "You're still here," he said, closing the door behind him. "I could say the same about you," I replied, setting down my pen. He smiled, leaning against the edge of my desk. "I couldn't leave without seeing you." My breath hitched, and I tried to keep my composure. "Julian, we're at work." "I know," he said, his voice soft as he reached out to brush a strand of hair from my face. "But I can't help myself when it comes to you." The kiss that followed was slow, deliberate, and entirely reckless. His hand slid down to my waist, pulling me closer as I melted into him. For a moment, the rest of the world faded away, and there was only Julian. His touch, his scent, the way he whispered my name like it was something sacred. After that, our affair became a delicate dance of risk and reward. We found ways to be together without raising suspicion, lunch breaks that turned into stolen kisses in the stairwell, late-night text exchanges that often ended with him at my door. Julian had a way of making even the most mundane moments feel electric. One evening, as we stood in the kitchen of his apartment, he turned to me with a bottle of wine in his hand and said, "You make the ordinary feel extraordinary, Margot." It was a simple statement, but it left me breathless. The secrecy of our relationship was both exhilarating and exhausting. At work, I was hyper-aware of every glance, every interaction, afraid that someone might notice the way Julian and I gravitated toward each other. My assistant, Ella, was the first to pick up on the subtle changes in my behavior. "You've been different lately," she said one morning as she handed me a stack of reports. "Different how?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "I don't know," she said, narrowing her eyes. "Happier, maybe. More distracted." I laughed nervously, brushing off her observation. "Must be the birthday glow." Ella didn't look convinced, but she didn't push the subject. The first real crack in our carefully constructed facade came during a company retreat. It was a weekend getaway to a secluded resort, meant to foster team bonding and creativity. Julian and I knew it would be risky, spending so much time together in close quarters, but the thought of being away from each other for 2 days was unbearable. The first evening was uneventful. We mingled with coworkers, keeping a safe distance, but every glance we exchanged was charged with unspoken longing. Later that night, when the rest of the team had retired to their rooms, Julian slipped a note under my door. "Meet me in the garden. Midnight." My heart raced as I read the note, and I knew I should ignore it. But when the clock struck 12, I found myself walking through the quiet pathways of the resort's garden, drawn to him like a moth to a flame. When I found him, he was leaning against a stone bench, his silhouette illuminated by the soft glow of the moonlight. "You came," he said, his voice low and warm. "I shouldn't have," I whispered, stepping closer. "But you did," he replied, reaching out to take my hand. The kiss we shared under the stars was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Slow, tender, and filled with a quiet desperation. It felt like the world had fallen away, leaving only the two of us in that moment. But the magic didn't last. The next morning, as I sat in the dining hall with my coworkers, I noticed Ella watching me. Her gaze flicked between me and Julian, and I could see the gears turning in her mind. She didn't say anything, but the knowing look on her face sent a chill down my spine. Later that day, she cornered me in the hallway. "Margot," she said, her tone carefully neutral, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," I replied, trying to sound casual. "What's going on with you and Julian?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, I couldn't find my voice. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said finally, forcing a laugh. She raised an eyebrow. "You don't have to lie to me. I've seen the way he looks at you, and the way you look at him." I opened my mouth to respond, but she held up a hand to stop me. "I'm not judging you," she said softly. "But be careful, Margot. People are starting to notice." Ella's warning stayed with me, but it wasn't enough to stop me from seeing Julian. If anything, it only made our time together feel more precious, like we were fighting against the clock. One evening, as we lay tangled together on his couch, Julian turned to me with a serious expression. "Margot," he said, his voice filled with quiet intensity, "what are we doing?" I frowned, propping myself up on one elbow. "What do you mean?" "I mean this," he said, gesturing between us. "Sneaking around, hiding how we feel. Don't you want more?" His words sent a wave of panic through me. "Julian, you know this isn't simple." "It could be," he said, his hand brushing against my cheek, "if we stopped caring about what other people think." I looked away, my chest tightening. "It's not that easy," he sighed, pulling me into his arms. "It could be," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. As much as I wanted to believe him, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of a cliff. Every kiss, every stolen moment, brought us closer to the inevitable fall. And deep down, I knew the fall was coming. I should have known it couldn't last. Secrets have a way of coming to light, no matter how carefully you try to keep them hidden. The unraveling began with an email. It arrived one rainy Thursday morning as I was settling into my office, sipping my coffee and preparing for a long day of meetings. The subject line was innocuous enough: HR concern, private and confidential. I opened it, expecting some routine inquiry about workplace compliance, or a training session I'd forgotten to attend. Instead, my stomach dropped. Margot, we have received a report regarding a potential conflict of interest and inappropriate conduct between you and one of our contracted talent members. Please meet with HR at 2 p.m. to discuss further. I stared at the screen, the words blurring before my eyes. My heart began to race, my thoughts spinning out of control. Who reported us? How much did they know? My hands shook as I reached for my phone, dialing Julian. He picked up on the first ring. Margot, he said, his voice warm and familiar. We have a problem, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. By the time 2 p.m. rolled around, my anxiety was at an all-time high. I walked into the HR office, doing my best to project an air of calm, even as my heart threatened to pound out of my chest. Victoria, the head of HR, sat across from me, her expression unreadable. Beside her was another member of the HR team, a younger woman with a laptop open in front of her. Margot, thank you for coming in, Victoria began, her tone professional but firm. We've received an anonymous tip alleging that you've been engaging in a personal relationship with Julian Caro, one of our contracted voice actors. Is there any truth to this claim? I opened my mouth to deny it, but she held up a hand, stopping me. Before you answer, I want to let you know that we've reviewed some evidence provided to us. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed screenshots of text messages between Julian and me, emails we'd exchanged about meeting up outside of work, and even a photo of the two of us walking together in the garden during the company retreat. The room seemed to close in around me. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and completely powerless. I'm not going to deny it, I said finally, my voice trembling. But I want to make it clear that it hasn't affected my work or the project. Victoria nodded, her expression remaining neutral. Thank you for your honesty. However, this is a serious breach of our policies regarding workplace relationships, particularly when there is a potential imbalance of power. I swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over me. When I left the meeting, I went straight to Julian's apartment. He opened the door before I could knock, as if he'd been waiting for me. What happened? He asked, pulling me inside. They know, I said, my voice breaking. Someone reported us. HR has everything. Texts, emails, photos. They're launching a formal investigation. Julian's jaw tightened, his hand gripping mine. Let me take the fall, he said firmly. I'll tell them it was all me, that I pursued you. No, I said, shaking my head. I won't let you do that. You've worked too hard to build your reputation. And you haven't? He shot back. I sighed, leaning into him. This is my mess to deal with. I'll take responsibility. The fallout was swift. By the end of the week, I was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. Julian, being a contractor, wasn't subject to the same scrutiny, but the whispers and stares at work were enough to make him withdraw from the project entirely. Ella, my assistant, came to my office on my last day before leave, her expression a mix of sympathy and regret. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said quietly. I froze, realizing what she was admitting. It was you, I said, my voice barely audible. I didn't give them everything, she said quickly. Just enough to raise a flag. I thought it would be a warning, not. I stared at her, my chest tightening. Why, Ella? I was trying to protect you, she said, tears welling in her eyes. You were taking risks, Margot. I didn't want to see you lose everything. Her words stung, but I couldn't find it in me to be angry. Deep down, I knew she wasn't wrong. The worst confrontation came at home. My son, Daniel, showed up unannounced one evening, his face filled with a mixture of concern and disappointment. Mom, he said, closing the door behind him, I've been hearing things about you and some actor you're working with. I felt my heart sink. Daniel? Is it true? He interrupted, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. I hesitated, then nodded. Yes. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. What were you thinking? You've worked so hard to get where you are, and now you're risking everything for what? I didn't plan for this to happen, I said quietly. It just did. That's not good enough, he said, his voice cracking. You're supposed to be the one who has it all together. You're supposed to be better than this. His words cut deep, and for the first time in years, I felt like a failure. Not just as a professional, but as a mother. By the time I returned to Julian's apartment that night, I was emotionally drained. He opened the door, pulling me into his arms without a word. I can't do this anymore, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. It's too much. He held me tightly, his own pain evident in the way he clung to me. Margot, please, we can get through this. Together. I pulled back, looking into his eyes. I love you, Julian, but I can't keep destroying everything around me for this. His expression crumbled, but he nodded. If this is what you need. It's not what I want, I said, my voice breaking. But it's what I have to do. That was the last time I saw Julian. We parted on bittersweet terms, knowing that what we had was real but unsustainable. As I walked away from his apartment, I felt like a part of me was being left behind. And yet, I knew it was the only choice I could make. It's been 3 months since I ended things with Julian, and my life has been in a kind of suspended animation ever since. The HR investigation concluded with a voluntary resignation, on my part. It wasn't officially labeled as misconduct, but the whispers and judgment from my colleagues made it clear I could never return to that office again. I packed up my belongings and left Apex Interactive behind, the weight of my decisions following me like a shadow. I took a small freelance project to keep myself busy, but it's not the same. My days are quieter now, filled with long stretches of solitude, broken only by the occasional call from my son, Daniel, or an email from a former coworker asking for advice. Daniel and I have started to repair things, though it hasn't been easy. When he came to visit last weekend, I apologized again for disappointing him, but he shook his head and said, "I just want you to be happy, Mom. Whatever that means." His words stayed with me long after he left. As for Julian, he disappeared from my life as cleanly as if he had never been there at all. There were no calls, no texts, no emails. I think he knew that reaching out would only make things harder for both of us. But that didn't stop me from checking my phone more often than I'd care to admit, hoping for a message that never came. The silence was unbearable at first. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering if he was thinking of me as much as I was thinking of him. But as the weeks turned into months, the ache dulled into something quieter, something I could live with. Yesterday I received a package in the mail. There was no return address, but I knew who it was from the moment I saw the handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter and 2 tickets to a stage play Julian was starring in, a return to live theater after years away. The letter was short but heartfelt. Margot, you were right to end things, but that doesn't mean I've stopped caring. You reminded me of who I used to be, and for that, I'll always be grateful. If you ever want to see the part of me that you helped bring back, the tickets are yours. No expectations, no strings, just gratitude. Julian. I stared at the letter for a long time, my emotions swirling. Last night, I went to the theater. I didn't tell anyone, didn't bring a guest. I just slipped into one of the back rows and waited for the lights to dim. When Julian stepped onto the stage, my breath caught. He looked as confident and commanding as ever, his voice carrying through the room with the kind of power that made every word feel like a revelation. For the next 2 hours, I let myself be transported by his performance, marveling at the man I had known so intimately, yet could never fully hold on to. When the play ended, the audience erupted into applause, and Julian took his bow. As he straightened, his eyes scanned the crowd, and for a brief moment, they landed on me. He didn't smile, didn't react, just held my gaze for a beat longer than necessary before turning away. It was enough. As I walked out of the theater that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: closure. What Julian and I had was beautiful, messy, and fleeting, but it was exactly what I needed in that chapter of my life. He reminded me that I was still capable of passion, of taking risks, of feeling alive. And now, it was time to figure out what came next. I hadn't realized I'd left it there. The journal, small and unassuming, sat in the middle of the coffee table, its soft leather cover slightly worn from years of use. I had meant to put it away, to keep it hidden like I always did, but the doorbell had rung, and in my rush to answer it, I'd forgotten. By the time I came back into the living room, Nathan was standing over the table, the journal open in his hands. "What's this?" he asked, his voice light but curious. My breath caught, panic flaring in my chest. "Nathan," I said quickly, crossing the room. "That's private." He looked up, startled by the sharpness in my tone. His eyes flicked to mine, and then back to the journal, his expression shifting to something softer. "Sorry," he said, closing it carefully. "I didn't mean to pry." I snatched it from his hands, clutching it to my chest as if it were something precious. My heart was racing, my cheeks hot with embarrassment. "It's nothing," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "Just an old habit." Nathan studied me for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly. "I didn't read much," he said, his tone quieter now. "Just a few lines. But it didn't seem like nothing." I turned away, unable to meet his gaze. The journal felt heavy in my hands, the weight of it a stark reminder of the secrets it held, memories, confessions, pieces of myself I had never shared with anyone. "It's just something I do," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "To clear my head." "I get that," he said, his voice warm, understanding. I glanced at him, surprised by the softness in his expression. Nathan had always been thoughtful, more perceptive than most, but the way he was looking at me now, curious but not intrusive, made my chest tighten. "I shouldn't have left it out," I said, hugging the journal tighter. "It's okay," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We all have things we don't want other people to see." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. For a moment I wondered what he meant, what things he kept hidden, what secrets he carried. The moment passed, and Nathan moved toward the kitchen, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. "Let me know if you need help with dinner," he said over his shoulder, his tone casual again. I watched him go, my heart still racing, the journal clutched tightly to my chest. It wasn't the first time Nathan had surprised me. He had always been good at that, ever since I first met him. This boy who had grown into a man so quickly, it felt like I'd blinked and missed it. When he moved back into the house a few months ago, I told myself it was temporary, that he'd be gone again soon, off to some exciting new chapter of his life. But in the months since, his presence had changed the house in ways I hadn't anticipated. For years it had been quiet here, the kind of silence that settled deep in your bones and made you feel older than you were. After my husband passed, I had grown used to that silence, to the echo of my footsteps in the hall, to the long, empty evenings spent with nothing but a book and a glass of wine. Nathan had brought life back into the house. It was in the small things, the sound of his music drifting from upstairs, the sight of his sneakers kicked off by the door, the way he'd pop into the kitchen to chat while I cooked dinner. He filled the spaces that had felt so hollow, so empty for so long. But he also made me aware of myself, of the way I looked when I caught my reflection in the mirror, of the way my heart beat a little faster when he smiled, when he laughed, when he leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching me with that quiet, thoughtful gaze of his. It wasn't right. I knew that. He was my stepson, for God's sake. But knowing it didn't make it any easier to ignore. Later that evening, as I sat on the edge of my bed, the journal resting on my lap, I found myself flipping through its pages. The handwriting was neat but unsteady in places, the words raw and unfiltered. I stopped on one page, my breath catching as I read the lines I'd written weeks ago. "I miss feeling alive. I miss being seen." The truth of it hit me like a punch to the chest. For years I had buried those feelings, telling myself that it was enough to simply exist, to get through each day without falling apart. But now, with Nathan here, with the way he looked at me, spoke to me, it was harder to keep those feelings at bay. I closed the journal and set it aside, my hands trembling slightly. This was dangerous, I knew that. But as I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder what it would feel like to let myself be seen again. The next morning, I found Nathan in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a mug of coffee in hand. He was scrolling through something on his phone, the soft morning light catching in his hair and making him look younger, almost boyish. But when he looked up at me, his eyes were anything but boyish. "Morning," he said, his tone casual, though there was a faint edge to it. "Morning," I replied, avoiding his gaze as I moved to the coffee pot. My hands trembled slightly as I poured myself a cup, the events of the previous day still too fresh in my mind. I hoped he wouldn't bring it up, that we could just pretend it hadn't happened. But Nathan had never been one to let things slide. "So," he said, setting his mug down on the counter. "About yesterday." I froze, my fingers tightening around the handle of my mug. "What about it?" He shrugged, his tone light but probing. That journal. You seemed pretty protective of it. It's private, I said quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. I get that, he said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. I'm not trying to pry. I just... He hesitated, his gaze softening. I couldn't help wondering what's in there that's so personal. I turned to face him, my chest tight. Nathan, I told you, it's just something I use to clear my head. It's nothing important. His brow furrowed and he leaned forward slightly, his arms crossed over his chest. It didn't seem like nothing, he said quietly. I opened my mouth to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped me. It wasn't judgmental or intrusive, it was curious, concerned. Nathan, I said softly, setting my mug down on the counter, it's not something I'm ready to talk about. Okay, he said after a moment, his tone gentle. But, if you ever do want to talk, I'm here. The sincerity in his voice, the way he was looking at me, it made my chest ache. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. For a moment, the silence between us stretched, heavy and charged. I wasn't trying to make you uncomfortable, he said finally, his voice quieter now. I care about you, that's all. His words hung in the air, and I felt my breath catch. I know you do, I said, my voice trembling slightly. Nathan hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but then he nodded, picking up his mug again. Okay, he said, his tone lighter. I'll leave it alone. I nodded, grateful for the reprieve, but as he left the kitchen, I couldn't shake the feeling that the conversation wasn't over. Later that afternoon, I found myself in the living room, tidying up the scattered magazines and throw pillows that seemed to multiply when Nathan was home. The journal was safely tucked away in my bedroom, but the memory of his words lingered. I care about you. It wasn't the first time he'd said it, but this time felt different. There was a weight to it, an unspoken depth that I didn't know how to handle. The sound of footsteps behind me made me turn, and I saw Nathan standing in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets. You don't have to clean up after me, you know, he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It's not about you, I said, though my tone lacked conviction. He stepped into the room, his movements unhurried. You do too much, he said quietly. I rolled my eyes, trying to brush off the comment. I'm fine, Nathan. You always say that, he said, his tone soft but insistent. But are you? I froze, the question catching me off guard. What do you mean? I see how hard you work to hold everything together, he said, his gaze steady. But who's taking care of you? The sincerity in his voice, the concern in his eyes, it was too much. I looked away, focusing on the magazine in my hands. I don't need anyone to take care of me, I said quietly. That's not true, he said, stepping closer. Everyone needs someone. The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I turned to face him, my hands trembling slightly. Nathan, why are you saying this? Because I care about you, he said simply. The room felt impossibly still, the air between us charged with something I couldn't name. You shouldn't, I whispered, my voice breaking. Why not? He asked, his tone gentle. Because it's not right, I said, my chest tightening. Because I'm your stepmother. Nathan shook his head, a faint, bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. That doesn't change how I feel, he said softly. The honesty in his voice, the quiet conviction, it was overwhelming. I turned away, my hands gripping the back of the couch as I tried to steady myself. Nathan, this can't happen, I said, my voice trembling. He didn't respond right away, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost a whisper. I know it's complicated, he said. But that doesn't mean it's not real. His words hung in the air, and I felt my resolve wavering. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, to put an end to this before it went any further. But the truth I couldn't admit, even to myself, was that he wasn't wrong. By the time evening rolled around, the tension that had been building all day felt almost unbearable. I tried to shake it off, busying myself in the kitchen with dinner. Cooking had always been my refuge. The rhythmic chopping of vegetables, the sizzle of oil in the pan, it gave me something to focus on, something tangible to control. But tonight, even that wasn't enough. Nathan appeared in the doorway just as I was setting the table. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, his expression softer than it had been earlier. Need any help? He asked. I shook my head, keeping my eyes on the plates I was arranging. No, it's all done. He stepped inside anyway. grabbing the silverware and placing it next to the plates. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, as though he was searching for an excuse to stay close. The silence between us stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable, and I found myself glancing at him as he worked. There was something about the way he moved, the quiet confidence in his posture, that made it hard to look away. "Thanks," I said softly, breaking the silence. Nathan looked up, his lips curving into a small smile. "For what?" "For helping," I said, though the words felt too simple for what I really meant. "Anytime," he said, his voice warm. We sat down to eat, and for a while the conversation was light. We talked about small things, his plans for the week, a show he'd started watching, the weather. But as the meal went on, the casual ease between us began to give way to something deeper. "You've been quiet today," he said, his tone gentle. I looked at him, startled by the sudden shift. "I guess I've had a lot on my mind," I admitted. "Care to share?" he asked, his gaze steady. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around my glass. "It's nothing important," I said, though we both knew it wasn't true. Nathan leaned back in his chair, studying me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "You're allowed to have things on your mind. You know," he said softly, "you don't always have to carry everything by yourself." The sincerity in his voice, the way he looked at me as though he could see straight through me. It was disarming. "I'm used to it," I said, trying to sound casual. "That doesn't mean you should be," he said, his tone firm but kind. I looked down at my plate, unable to meet his gaze. "It's just hard to talk about some things," I said quietly. Nathan didn't respond right away, and when I finally glanced up, his expression was softer, his eyes full of understanding. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said. "But if you ever want to, I'm here." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, and I felt my breath catch. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. After dinner, we moved to the living room. Nathan stretched out on the couch, his head resting against the arm, while I curled up in the armchair with a mug of tea. The soft glow of the lamp bathed the room in a warm light, and the distant hum of the cicadas outside added a soothing rhythm to the quiet. "I remember sitting here with Dad," Nathan said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. I looked up, startled by the mention of his father. "You do?" He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, he used to sit right there," he said, gesturing to the armchair where I was sitting, reading the newspaper or watching the game. A pang of bittersweet nostalgia settled in my chest. "He loved this room," I said softly. Nathan nodded, his expression turning wistful. "I miss him," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "Me too," I said, the words catching in my throat. For a while, we sat in silence, the weight of shared grief settling over us. It wasn't heavy or suffocating, but rather a quiet, mutual understanding that bound us together in a way nothing else could. "I don't know how you did it," Nathan said suddenly, his gaze fixed on me. "Did what?" I asked, confused. "Held everything together after he passed," he said, his voice tinged with awe. "I was barely keeping it together, and you were just there. For me, for everyone." The sincerity in his voice, the admiration in his eyes, it was overwhelming. "I didn't have a choice," I said softly. "Someone had to." "Yeah," he said, his tone gentle. "But that doesn't mean it was easy." I looked away, my chest tight. "It wasn't," I admitted. Nathan sat up then, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You don't have to be strong all the time," he said quietly. The words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt my eyes sting with unshed tears. "Nathan, I hesitated, unsure of what to say. He reached out then, his hand brushing lightly against mine where it rested on the arm of the chair. The touch was brief but grounding, steadying me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. "I'm here," he said softly. The simplicity of his words, the quiet conviction in his tone, it was too much. I nodded, unable to speak, and let the silence settle around us once again. As the night deepened, the tension between us grew heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. And though we didn't speak of it, I knew we were both thinking the same thing. The house was silent when I woke later that night, the kind of stillness that presses against your skin and amplifies every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind outside. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying Nathan's words over and over in my head. "I see you, and I care about you, more than you realize." My chest ached with the weight of it. a confusing mix of emotions I couldn't untangle. There was warmth in his words, yes, but also danger. A kind of unspoken invitation that I wasn't sure I was ready to accept. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet brushing against the cool floor. Sleep wasn't coming, not with my mind racing like this. I pulled on my robe and made my way downstairs, hoping that maybe a cup of tea would help quiet the storm inside me. The kitchen was dimly lit, the faint glow from the under-cabinet lights casting soft shadows across the counters. I moved quietly, not wanting to disturb the stillness. But as I reached for the kettle, I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps behind me. I turned, startled, to find Nathan standing in the doorway. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low, careful. I shook my head, my hand still resting on the kettle. "No?" "Same," he said, stepping into the room. He was wearing a plain t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair slightly tousled, his expression softer in the low light. We stood there for a moment, the silence between us heavy, but not uncomfortable. "Want some tea?" I offered, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, moving to lean against the counter as I filled the kettle and set it on the stove. The faint hum of the burner filled the space, a quiet background to the tension lingering between us. "What's on your mind?" Nathan asked after a moment, his tone gentle but probing. I glanced at him, startled by the question. "What do you mean?" "You've been distant," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Since dinner. Since earlier today, really." I turned away, focusing on the kettle as though it held all the answers. "I've just had a lot to think about," I said softly. "Like what?" he pressed, his voice quiet but insistent. I hesitated, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Like us," I admitted finally, the words trembling as they left my lips. Nathan didn't respond right away, and when I finally turned to look at him, his expression was unreadable. "What about us?" he asked, his tone steady. I let out a shaky breath, my chest tightening. "Nathan, whatever this is, it's complicated, and I don't know how to handle it." He stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate. "It doesn't have to be," he said softly. "Yes, it does," I said quickly, my voice breaking, "because it's not just about what we feel, there are rules, boundaries." "Boundaries that don't change the truth," he interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. I stared at him, my heart pounding. "And what truth is that?" "That I care about you," he said, stepping even closer. "That I see you, really see you, in a way I don't think anyone else has in a long time." His words hit me like a punch to the chest, and I felt tears sting at the corners of my eyes. "You shouldn't say things like that," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Why not?" he asked gently. "Because they're true?" I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. The intensity in his eyes, the raw vulnerability in his voice. It was too much. "Nathan," I began, my voice faltering. But before I could finish, he reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against my arm. The touch was warm, steady, grounding me even as I felt like I might fall apart. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. "Just don't shut me out." The quiet plea in his voice, the sincerity in his eyes, it broke something in me. I felt the tears spill over, hot and unrelenting. And before I knew what I was doing, I stepped closer, my head bowing as I tried to catch my breath. Nathan didn't hesitate. He pulled me into his arms, his embrace warm and steady, and I clung to him like a lifeline. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice a soothing whisper against my hair. "You're not alone." The words broke me completely, and I sobbed against his chest, the weight of everything I'd been holding back finally spilling over. For the first time in years, I felt seen. I felt heard. And as Nathan held me, his hands gentle, his presence unwavering, I let myself believe, just for a moment, that maybe I didn't have to carry it all alone. The house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Nathan's arms were still wrapped around me, steady and warm, and I couldn't bring myself to move. His embrace felt too safe, too solid, as though letting go would mean unraveling completely. "You've been holding this in for a long time, haven't you?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded against his chest, the words too tangled in my throat to speak. "You don't have to carry everything on your own," he said, his hands gently rubbing small circles against my back. "You never did." The truth of his words settled over me, heavy and unrelenting. For so long, I'd convinced myself that being strong meant bearing everything in silence. But here, in Nathan's arms, I felt the weight begin to shift. the cracks in my armor widening. When I finally pulled back, his hands lingered on my arms, his touch grounding me. I looked up at him, my breath hitching at the intensity in his gaze. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice trembling. "You don't have to thank me," he replied, his tone firm but gentle. "I care about you. You don't have to do this alone." The way he looked at me, steady, unwavering, made my chest tighten. There was no judgment in his eyes, no hesitation, just quiet understanding. I took a shaky breath, stepping back to put some distance between us. "I should make that tea," I said, my voice unsteady. Nathan didn't stop me as I turned back to the counter, but I could feel his eyes on me, the tension between us palpable. I busied myself with the kettle, my hands trembling as I poured the hot water over the tea bags. "You don't have to talk about it," he said after a moment, his voice breaking the silence. "But I hope you know I'm here. Whenever you're ready." I swallowed hard, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill again. "I know," I said quietly, "and that means more than you realize." I handed him a mug, our fingers brushing briefly as he took it. The touch sent a shiver through me, and I pulled my hand back quickly, afraid of what he might see in my face. "Thanks," he said, his tone soft. We moved to the living room, settling into our usual spots, me on the couch, Nathan in the armchair. The warm glow of the lamp cast long shadows across the room, and the tea in my hands provided a welcome distraction from the weight of his presence. For a while we sat in silence, the quiet between us filled with something I couldn't quite name. I could feel his eyes on me, could sense the questions he wasn't asking, and it made my heart race in a way I wasn't prepared for. "You're different when you're with me," Nathan said suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his gaze steady. "You let your guard down. You're softer." The comment made my cheeks flush, and I looked away, focusing on the steam rising from my mug. "That's not true," I said quietly. "It is," he insisted, his tone gentle but firm. "You don't have to hide so much with me. You don't have to pretend." The sincerity in his voice, the quiet conviction, made something inside me ache. "I've been pretending for so long," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Nathan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he studied me. "Why?" "Because it's easier," I said softly. "Because if I let myself feel everything, I don't know if I'll be able to keep going." "You don't have to hold it all in," he said, his voice steady. "Not with me." I looked at him then, my chest tightening at the intensity in his gaze. The space between us felt impossibly small, even though we weren't touching, and I could feel the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on me. "You make it sound so simple," I said, my voice trembling. "Maybe it is," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Or maybe you just make it harder than it needs to be." I let out a shaky laugh, the sound catching in my throat. "You don't know what you're asking of me." "I'm asking you to let yourself be happy," he said simply. The quiet honesty in his voice, the warmth in his expression, it was too much. I looked away, my hands tightening around the mug in my lap. "You deserve that," he continued, his tone softer now. "You deserve to feel alive again." His words hit me like a blow, and I felt the tears rising again. I blinked rapidly, trying to hold them back, but when I looked up at him, his expression softened even further. "It's okay," he said gently. "You don't have to decide anything right now. Just don't shut me out." The plea in his voice, the quiet vulnerability, made my heart ache. "I won't," I whispered, my voice breaking. Nathan leaned back, his gaze still on me, but he didn't press further. The tension between us had shifted, softening into something quieter, something fragile but unyielding. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. The storm rolled in that evening, the rain starting as a soft patter against the windows before building into a steady, insistent rhythm. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, soothing sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls. I stood in the kitchen, staring out at the darkened sky as I absently dried the last of the dishes. The house felt warmer than usual, the lights casting a golden glow over the quiet rooms. But it did little to calm the storm brewing inside me. Nathan had been in the living room for most of the evening, the faint sound of the television filtering through the house. I had been avoiding him, not intentionally, I told myself, but because I needed space to think. But no matter how much distance I tried to put between us, I couldn't stop replaying his words from the night before. You deserve to feel alive again. The truth of it had settled deep in my chest, too heavy to ignore. I had spent so long trying to convince myself that what I felt didn't matter, that my needs were secondary, irrelevant. But Nathan had seen through that. And now, I couldn't unsee it myself. The sound of footsteps behind me made me turn, and I found Nathan standing in the doorway. His hair was slightly damp, as though he'd just showered, and he was dressed in a plain black t-shirt and sweatpants. He looked comfortable, relaxed, but there was a quiet intensity in his gaze that sent a shiver through me. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, cutting back to the sink. "Yes. Just cleaning up." "You've been in here for a while," he said, stepping into the room. "I needed something to do," I admitted, my hands tightening on the dish towel. Nathan leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. "You've been avoiding me," he said softly, his tone gentle but direct. I froze, my breath catching. "I haven't." "You have," he interrupted, though there was no accusation in his voice. "And I get it, I do, but I wish you wouldn't." I turned to look at him, my chest tight. "Nathan, this is complicated." "I know it is," he said, stepping closer, "but avoiding it isn't going to make it any less complicated." The honesty in his voice, the quiet conviction in his expression, it was overwhelming. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice trembling. "You don't have to know," he said, his tone steady. "Just let me in, that's all I'm asking." His words broke something in me, and before I could stop myself, I blurted, "I'm scared." Nathan's brow furrowed, and he took another step closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch my arm. "Of what?" "Of everything," I said, my voice cracking. "Of what this means, of what people would think, of what happens if I let myself feel this." Nathan's fingers tightened slightly on my arm, his touch grounding me. "Do you think I'm not scared too?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. I looked up at him, startled by the raw emotion in his eyes. "I've thought about this every day since I moved back here," he admitted. "About what it means, about what it says about me, about us. But the one thing I keep coming back to is that it's real. This, what I feel for you. It's real, and I think you feel it too." His words left me breathless, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely think. "Nathan, tell me I'm wrong," he said softly, his gaze searching mine. "And I'll stop. I'll walk away right now, and I won't bring it up again." I opened my mouth, the words caught in my throat. I wanted to say it, to deny everything, to put an end to this before it went any further. But I couldn't, because he wasn't wrong. Instead of speaking, I reached up, my fingers trembling as they brushed against his cheek. The warmth of his skin, the way he leaned into my touch, it was enough to unravel me completely. Nathan didn't wait. He closed the distance between us, his hands cupping my face as he kissed me. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as though he were giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands clutching the fabric of his shirt as the kiss deepened. The world seemed to fall away, the storm outside nothing more than a distant hum. All that mattered was the feel of his lips on mine, the way his hands steadied me as though he knew I might collapse. When we finally pulled apart, our breaths were ragged, our foreheads resting together. "This is crazy," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Maybe," he said, his tone soft, "but it's ours." The weight of his words, the quiet certainty in his voice, it made my chest ache with something I couldn't name. For the first time in years, I felt alive. The morning came slowly, the pale light of dawn creeping into the room and painting everything in muted shades of gray and gold. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the events of the night before replaying in my mind with startling clarity. Nathan's touch, his voice, the way he'd looked at me as though I were the only thing in the world that mattered. It all lingered, filling the quiet with a weight I couldn't escape. I knew I should feel regret, guilt, something that told me what we'd done was wrong. But instead, all I felt was the steady thrum of my heart and the faint, fragile bloom of something I hadn't dared to feel in years, hope. I slipped out of bed, the cool floor beneath my feet grounding me as I made my way to the kitchen. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that comes only in the earliest hours of the day. I busied myself with making coffee, the familiar routine calming the storm inside me. As I poured the steaming liquid into a mug, I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps behind me. "Morning," Nathan said, his voice low and slightly husky from sleep. I turned to find him standing in the doorway, his hair tousled, his t-shirt slightly wrinkled. He looked at me with a softness that made my chest tighten, and I had to look away, focusing instead on stirring cream into my coffee. "Morning," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. Nathan stepped into the kitchen, leaning against the counter as he watched me. "Couldn't sleep?" I shook my head, taking a sip of coffee to steady myself. "No, you?" "Not much," he admitted, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Kept thinking about last night." His words sent a shiver through me, and I set the mug down on the counter, my hands trembling slightly. "Nathan, about last night?" "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly, his tone gentle but firm. "I know it's a lot to process. I need you to know that I don't regret it." The sincerity in his voice, the quiet conviction, it was almost too much. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice trembling. "You don't have to do anything right now," he said softly. "But I don't want you to think this was a mistake. It wasn't, not to me." I looked at him then, my chest tightening at the raw honesty in his expression. "It's not that simple," I said, my voice breaking. "I know," he said, stepping closer. "But we'll figure it out. Together." The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting, and for a moment I felt like I couldn't breathe. "Nathan, this changes everything," I whispered. "Maybe it does," he said. "But maybe that's not a bad thing." The quiet confidence in his voice, the way he looked at me as though he believed every word, it was enough to make my resolve falter. I closed my eyes, letting out a shaky breath. "I don't want to hurt you," I said softly. "You're not," he said, his hand brushing against mine. "You couldn't." The warmth of his touch, the steadiness of his presence, it was overwhelming. I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze, and for a moment the rest of the world fell away. But then the weight of reality settled over me, and I pulled my hand back, the loss of his touch leaving a hollow ache in its wake. "I need time," I said quietly, my voice trembling. Nathan nodded, his expression softening. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." His words settled over me like a promise, fragile but unyielding. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. Later that morning, after Nathan had left for a walk, I sat by the window with my coffee, staring out at the garden. The storm from the night before had left everything damp and glistening, the sunlight breaking through the clouds in soft, golden rays. The house felt different now, quieter, heavier, as though it were holding its breath. I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The years of loneliness, the quiet ache of moving through life without someone to lean on. Nathan's presence had shaken something loose in me, something I'd buried so deeply, I hadn't even realized it was there. But what did it mean? What did it say about me, that I had let it happen, that I hadn't stopped it when I should have? I ran my fingers along the edge of the table, the same table where everything had changed. My chest ached with the weight of it all, guilt, fear, longing, and a strange, tentative hope that I didn't know how to hold. Maybe Nathan was right. Maybe I didn't have to have all the answers right now. Maybe it was enough to simply feel. When Nathan returned, the tension between us was quieter, softer, like the aftermath of a storm. He didn't press me, didn't ask for answers I wasn't ready to give. Instead, he simply sat with me, the unspoken understanding between us enough to fill the silence. As the day went on, I found myself thinking less about the risks and more about the possibilities. About what it might mean to let myself be happy again, even if it was complicated. The path ahead was uncertain, the future blurred and undefined. But as Nathan's hand brushed against mine, a faint smile tugging at his lips, I felt something shift. Hope.